So we've gotten through 157. Let's wrap it all up. What have we seen? We've seen that the world is a complex place, but there is a logic to it. In this class, our focus was on really just initially exposing you to the economic way of thinking. It takes practice. You got to put more into it to really master it, just like any skill. And the economic way of thinking isn't the only way of thinking about the world. Different perspectives give us different angles on the world. It's like the blind man and the elephant. A bunch of blind men are trying to figure out what an elephant is only by being able to touch a part of the elephant. The guy who's touching the tusk has a very different picture of what he's encountering compared to the guy who's touching its leg. So the economic way of thinking, this is focusing our attention on some particular things, basically by building up these sort of cornerstones. Individuals make choices, so we have scarcity, and we want to think about the people who actually are making choices as our unit of analysis. Right, so it's tempting to say things like the rich want to do this, the poor want to do that, this group wants to do this other thing. But in economics, it's not to say that there's no such thing as a group, but as a scientific method, we acknowledge that what we think of as groups doing things are really just collections of individuals doing things. So when we say the US went to Europe in World War II, we don't mean that all of us went there. We mean that some individuals, under orders from other individuals, did certain things that we, as shorthand, say the US went to war. So individuals making choices, which means that we are facing opportunity costs. And importantly, we're facing these costs on the margin. So we do one thing, that means we give up something else. But we're never giving up all of one thing for all of something else. Right? So we know that water is more important than diamonds, but we're never choosing between all the water and all the diamonds. When we're in a market, you could decide to buy more diamonds than you currently have, but you can't decide to buy all the diamonds in existence. Likewise, with the water, you're going to go buy a bottle of water from the CVS. So even though water is more important, a bottle of water is $1 and a diamond ring is $1,000. This is because we're facing different trade-offs and we're making the decision about what is the additional cost or the additional benefit. So thinking on the margin is a subtle thing that takes some practice. It really took me a lot longer than just one class to really wrap my head around. People pursue goals. So we're living in a world where individuals have their own goals, and what those goals are subjective. They are personal, right? So we all have our own wishes, our own desires, our own things that grind our gears and make it more costly to go down one path versus another. But we have goals and we try to achieve those goals. It's an economic way of thinking. We're assuming that people are trying to make their lives better as they see it. And as they see it is not something that is always obvious. Right? So I see people in big, giant lifted trucks, and I think that's silly, but that's just my preferences. Right? If it makes them happy, who am I to judge? Some people don't like the taste of cilantro because they've got a genetic thing, and that sucks because cilantro's great. But I can't judge them. I can't tell them that their preferences are wrong. But as an economist, I could tell them that given their preferences, maybe they are pursuing a line of action that gets them less of the things that they're after, and they could improve things by making wiser choices. And this is what we want out of the economic way of thinking, is both an understanding of why it is that people are doing what they're doing, and a way to think about how we're doing what we're doing and how we can make better choices. So economics, it's a lens. I like this metaphor for any science, really. Math gives you a lens on the universe. Psychology gives you a lens on human behavior. Sociology gives you a different lens. And economics is one lens among many. It's really like a toolkit. It's not necessarily one thing, it's just a set of models and ways of thinking about the world. And these models can help us to make better decisions. They can help us to find win-win situations. They show us how voluntary exchange creates wealth. It makes the world more prosperous. And we can see how moving society more in that direction over the past however many years, 500 years really is when private markets have really grown, that has been where we've seen the greatest increase in wealth in human history, right? So seeing why markets are necessary to have the modern life that we expect with things like treatments for cancer, or cars, or big TVs, right? Sometimes frivolous things, sometimes really important things. A really cool thing, and this was really the key idea that I wanted you to see in the iRose videos, is how markets work to generate information and incentives. Markets aggregate what we know about the world and what we want out of the world. And so the prices that we get in markets, it's not a perfect fit for any one of us, but it's sort of the best available estimate of the trade-offs at stake for different options that are available in the market. And another really big thing, again, with win-win situations, it is often the case that letting people pursue their own self-interest can lead to the greater good, and we want to not get in the way of that process. So often this all goes right. Often we get better goods at lower costs. Cars have gotten adjusted for inflation. For each dollar you're spending, you are getting a better car than you did 50 years ago. We are getting wealthier because of market competition over time. We cooperate, and that allows us and incentivizes us to get peace and prosperity. Economics is not just a question about how do we maximize things, but it's also a question about how do we get to a harmonious equilibrium. So this is a really cool thing when things go right. Economics is sort of the science of how this all goes right, how it is that we have a modern society where we cooperate so effectively with billions of people who we couldn't possibly hope to understand with very much depth. And yet, by getting the rules right, we get this incredible outcome. But it doesn't always go right. So sometimes incentives aren't properly aligned. Sometimes the rules of the game need to be fixed. How do we do this? Well, this is tough, right? So sometimes we have market failures. I pollute on you because no one owns the air. So what do we do about it? Maybe the government implements some regulations that improve this, right? And sometimes we just kind of get second best regulations, but sometimes we get regulations that are distorting because government itself is a common pool problem. There's a recursive nature to this. We want to solve the common pool problem with the government, but to get the good government, we need to have voters hold government accountable. And if we could do that, we could solve the pollution problem. So incentive problems and information problems are basically where things go wrong. And often this has a root cause in the rules of society, right? The rules in the market, what legal regulations we have, what property rights definitions we have, how courts enforce things. Sometimes we get it wrong, and that leads to inefficient outcomes that make us poorer rather than richer. So some specific things we've seen in this class that we've seen, especially the supply and demand models for bad government policy, with the caveat that taxes and subsidies might be useful to address externalities. We've seen that price controls are a really awful policy. Protectionism makes us poorer and also exposes us to greater risk of bad things like war. Pollution is bad, and we have externalities in all sorts of situations. And then the related concept of common pool resources and public goods. We've seen a lot of things. These are terms that you might not memorize, say, as of January, right? January 1st, this might all kind of float out of your head. But I hope that you'll be able to at least check Wikipedia for public goods. You think, oh, isn't that a public goods problem? When you see something in the news and you check Wikipedia and you say, oh, wait, no, I was wrong, it was this other thing. But you at least sort of have enough familiarity that you can find that information as you need it. Some of the solutions, some things that I hope you will take away, what economists think will make the world a better place. Getting property rights correct is a big thing, and it's a subtle problem, but it's important, right? So things like pollution have to do with how we define property rights. Climate change is an issue where we can't get the property rights correct for the sorts of rights that can be exchanged in a market. So understanding that problem is going to influence what we expect for possible solutions, but also how people respond to it. So property rights is a big way to solve a lot of problems. Taxing pollution is a big thing. Limiting power is important because power corrupts, and corrupted power leads to bad outcomes. We want to make free entry possible to the extent possible. We want to make it easy for people to enter a market and compete with the current players. And behind all of this, the complicated one that requires you to take some sociology classes is culture. It's complicated, but what can you do? So we can take a more general lesson and ask why it goes wrong, when it goes wrong. And let me, again, take a step back. 90% of the time, it goes right. 90% of the time, rational self-interest does lead to good outcomes. But sometimes people have these de facto rights that they can make over certain parts of the world, right? So I have a right to decide how I vote, and that leads to some political outcomes. I have rights about how I can use my car, and that leads to certain outcomes in terms of the used car market, but also in terms of traffic, right? There's all these overlapping rules, overlapping scenarios where the question is, who's making the decision and how is that decision going to affect the part of the world that I'm interested in knowing something about? So we have some understandings of why it goes wrong. I'm not going to read this slide. Pause and look those things up if you're curious, but we have some understanding. Economics provides some insight to why things can go wrong in the world. Again, most of the time things go well, right? Life is better. Life is healthier. We are richer than ever before. There are short run ups and downs, but the long run story is a huge improvement. People are freer. People are freer to be different than they were in the 50s. You were required to be much more conformist than you are in 2020. Wider groups of minorities are recognized. A lot of things are getting better. Government, that's a harder thing. That's something that I think we need to really worry about in the next 100 years of human history. But all of this is to say, things are going pretty well. As long as we keep doing the right sorts of things, right, then things can stay going pretty well. But we do need to really be careful. We need to understand that society is a complex thing, and simple sounding solutions are probably going to make things worse. And it's important to understand how and why that is the case. And of course, we do have, at the end of the day, normative things that we are going to disagree with. But Of course, we want to find that society that allows us to have those normative disagreements in a peaceful way. So, all told, things are still pretty good, right? So what should you do next? We're done the class. What can you do? I think taking more econ classes is a good idea, and I'm happy to point you in different directions depending on your interests. But just reading pop econ books, I think, is a really great way for a wider group of people to get access to economic knowledge. I love Tim Harford's books. He's great. I think he writes books that are good because they are general and they're about the principles. I think books that are about things in the news lose their value really quickly. I think that knowledge goes obsolete fast. So I would recommend looking for the classic pop econ books. Steve Landsberg has a good one. There's a bunch of good ones. Ask me on the Discord. I'm happy to tell you, or on the class blog. And something that I found really helpful that I didn't know existed until I was an undergrad, there are a lot of nonprofits that will do summer seminars. Now, maybe not this summer, but hopefully in a future summer. One that I went to as an undergrad was the Institute for Humane Studies. I believe they did do an online summer seminar series this past summer. They have a particular ideological axe to grind, so take that recommendation with a grain of salt, but ask around. There are a bunch of these, and I think that it's a really good experience to go hang out with a bunch of interested students for a week. You're just hanging out, talking about big ideas, connecting philosophy and history and economics and understanding the law. There's a lot of really interesting things you can learn at those intensive experiences outside of college. But of course, here you are in college, so take more econ classes. Thank you for participating this semester. I hope that you learned something valuable, and I hope that you will pursue it further. And if not, I hope that you will have some mental tools in the back of your brain that maybe someday will turn out to be useful in some unexpected context. Thank you, and good luck with your finals.